It's one of the most reported events nowadays. You can read it daily, about it daily, in the newspapers, in the social media, watch it on TV almost every evening. At the same time, there is a strong growing sense that this is a topic, a crisis that is dismissed as worth our attention, but not intervention. That it is one of those eternal, unsolvable conflict in a minuscule and obscure region. Better let it peter away and just not worth our actual intervention of the international community, and in particular the great powers. This, I would say, is wrong and very dangerous perceptions. Let us recall one of Putin's most memorable statements about a decade and a half ago, that the collapse of the Soviet Union was the worst catastrophe of the geopolitical catastrophe of the 20th century. What most people do not remember, that he actually referred to the national minorities cut off their homeland, basically the Russians. But what we find out, first of all, not only that how Putin acted on his own statement later on, but this is a problem that plagues the entire post-Soviet landscape, with ethno-national minorities cut off their homelands, and the lack of overlap between the political territorial sovereignty on the one hand and popular sovereignty on the other is a time bomb that keeps exploding in this region. Beyond that, this is a conflict that has all the ingredients to spill over and turn into something much worse than it already is. And we have to remember that already tens of thousands of people were killed in the last 2 decades in this region, and hundreds of thousands of refugees. There are issues all over. The issue of energy supplies from Azerbaijan to Europe that can be easily under threat if it continues. The threats made by the conflicting side, the warring sides, to strike at strategic sites of each other, nuclear plants on the one hand and water reservoirs on the other. It is a time of involvement of regional powers, Turkey, Iran, powers that are not known for their stabilizing contributions, but very often destabilizing. It's time of shifting alliances all over the region and the bordering Middle East. So we have strange bedfellows like Turkey, Israel, jihadists, and, or at least on paper, NATO siding with Azerbaijan or some kind of support. And of course, we have Russia on both sides of the fence supporting everyone. And at this point, everyone's wondering what Russia can do effectively, not just in terms of statements. And of course, the big question is where the United States is and where is the European Union in all of this. And just to top it, the issue of the religious fervor that is now inflamed more and more and just pouring oil already on the national issue. So we have here all the ingredients of something that is very clearly threatening to spill over to something much bigger. Our panelists today will discuss some of these issues and others, and notably they are deeply trained in the humanities, in history, social anthropology, but also are frequent commentators on current events in the region, aside from, of course, emerging from Stanford or working at Stanford. We'll start with Paul Stronski, a senior fellow in Carnegie, a program on Russia and Eurasia. Until 2015, Paul led a brilliant career in the State Department and the National Security Council, where he advised the President, the National Security Advisor, and the Secretary of State on Russian domestic policies, the US policy towards Russia and Central Asia and Eurasia. And notably, most relevant to our panel today, between 2007 and 2010, Paul served on the desk of the Armenia and Azerbaijan in the State Department. On top of it, Paul is the author of the prize-winning monograph on history of Tashkent prior to the Great Quake in 1966, which he wrote based on his dissertation here at Stanford. Robert Cruz is a professor of history at Stanford and a leading authority on Russia, Central Asia, the world of Islam and Afghanistan. He's the author of several highly acclaimed monographs, For Prophet and Tsar, on the Muslim community in the Russian Empire and Central Asia, and a very innovative history of Afghanistan, Afghan Modern, and the editor of several other volumes on various aspects of the ongoing war in Afghanistan. And he's a frequent contributor in various newspapers and outlets on current events in this region. We hope to be joined by Nona Shahnazarian. We hope that she will make it during our roundtable, a social anthropologist and a senior research fellow in the Institute of Archeology and Ethnography in Yerevan. Nona was affiliated with us in 2017 as a Carnegie Fellow, and she's a specialist on war, gender, migration, and diaspora in the Caucasus, and the author of two excellent monographs, one on the tight embrace of tradition, war, and patriarchy, and the other, more recently, on memory and war, on the Armenian communities on villages during the Second World War. And with this, we'll turn to our panelists, and please, Paul, take over.
Well, thank you very much, Amir. It's a pleasure to be back at a Stanford event, even if I'm not physically at Stanford. And the background behind Jovana really makes me wish I were back there and not about to enter winter on the East Coast. First of all, I think I would just like to highlight what Amir started with. And I think what we are really seeing happen today in the South Caucasus, and we're seeing it in other parts of the former Soviet Union too. You just go out to Kyrgyzstan, is we're really seeing the unfinished business of the USSR's collapse still occurring. This is 30 years on, and we are still seeing lingering problems from the 1990s bubble up and cause problems both for Russia as well as for the international community. But I think if you're Russia and you look around your immediate neighborhood, you see a lot of big problems, and have a very difficult time trying to figure out how to solve them. Now, what I think we're seeing right now in Nagorno-Karabakh between Armenia and Azerbaijan is what we're seeing on the ground is really quite troubling. We have seen the bloodiest fighting since the 1990s, since the 1994 ceasefire, and it is showing no signs of dying down. As Amir mentioned, this is on the news, but the world is distracted and world leaders are distracted. I'm sitting here in Washington and I've sort of been a little bit appalled, not a little bit, quite appalled by the real lack of engagement of the United States. Usually, if we go back to the 2000s, President George W. Bush was actively involved in this, and President Obama was too. We're not seeing a whole lot of engagement. Our first big step into this is tomorrow, when Secretary Pompeo will meet the foreign ministers of both countries. But for the first 3 weeks of this conflict, we have not seen the U.S. pay a whole lot of attention at all. Thousands are dead. It's the largest casualty we've seen in 25 years, and efforts to dampen the hostilities, a Russian brokered ceasefire and then a French brokered ceasefire collapsed immediately. Hopefully the United States will have a little better luck tomorrow, although I'm not all that optimistic. And one of the things I think, I just want to highlight Amir's point that this really is something we should be paying attention to. And if you just look at the human costs of what has happened so far, it is really tragic. So Armenia, I checked before this, it now says somewhere between, I think it's about 800 plus troops are dead, at least 30 plus civilians have been killed. Thousands more have been wounded. Azerbaijani figures are likely quite similar, but the Azerbaijani government has neither released its civilian nor military casualties. And we're seeing the fighting move into more mountainous areas, which will likely make it a lot bloodier in the weeks to come. About 70,000 people, according to some UN estimates, have fled the Nagorno-Karabakh territory. That's roughly half of what the population was 3 weeks ago. We are seeing civilians on the Azerbaijani side, particularly towards the line of contact in the war areas near the war zone, also being displaced as well. So we're seeing tragedy on both sides. I think the fact that we're doing this virtually, I don't think I need to remind many people that COVID is still a problem in the world, and it's compounding the situation, particularly for those people who are displaced, as well as those who are forced to shelter underground in civilian areas that have been targeted with cluster bombs and everything else on both sides of the conflict. And we're seeing a rapid COVID spread as well to the humanitarian issues. So there's a clear reason why the international community and the United States should be paying attention. Now, I'm not going to go back into the long history of this conflict, and if I did, I'd probably anger people on all sides. But I'm going to do a little bit of how we got to where we are in 2020, because we've lived with this conflict for 3 decades. For the most part, we've called it a frozen conflict. I would say that's not quite accurate, because people have been dying on both sides. There have been ceasefire violations every year and flare-ups. The last one was in 2016. It was a 4-day war. And efforts to mediate this conflict by the 3 big mediators that have been involved, the European Union, which is represented primarily by France in this process, the United States and Russia. They've worked very hard to try to find a solution, but I would argue that the biggest problem is that the sides, both parties, have been very resistant to a solution. So what we've been sort of seeing is almost a ticking time bomb going off, where the core grievances of both sides have not been addressed. The core grievances of the Azerbaijani side is the huge amount of Azerbaijani territory that is occupied by Armenia and hasn't been returned. And the core grievance of the Armenian side is that the Armenian Karabakh security is threatened, while Azerbaijan complains about the occupied territories. They have been doing ceasefire violations, have been threatening the Nagorno-Karabakh region, which is one of the reasons why the Armenian side has been very reticent to give back those territories that are surrounding Azerbaijan. So we've seen sort of the 2 grievances of both sides remain unresolved, and neither side seems to be willing to budge. We've also seen a breakdown in the trust between the Armenians and the Azerbaijanis just in the last few years. There was a lot of expectation after the Velvet Revolution in Armenia that the new Armenian leader, who had a lot of popular legitimacy and domestic legitimacy, could help jumpstart peace talks. At the start, they actually had some cordial talks, created a phone line, and there were hopes that there could be some wiggle room. The Azerbaijani side in 2018 really de-escalated its ceasefire violations in the hopes that de-escalation would enable Armenia to be more flexible on the occupied territories. What we've seen is Armenia and Pashinyan wasn't actually able to do that. Pashinyan himself is a person from Yerevan. He's not a Karabakh Armenian, and he is not a war participant or a participant in the Karabakh movement of the late Soviet era. He was a civil society activist and journalist who rose to power. So he really had to show his bona fides as a military leader and as a nationalist. And he gave a very fiery patriotic speech in Karabakh about a year ago, where he said Karabakh was Armenian, and that led to a sort of a deterioration in the relations between Baku and Yerevan, and between the 2 actual leaders. And then since then, we've just seen fiery rhetoric out of both capitals. We've also seen 2 countries that have, again, COVID devastated their public health sectors, their economies. We've seen a lot of public grumbling in both sides. The war has united both countries behind their leaderships for now. And we've also seen a world that has been really quite distracted. We have COVID, we have the US elections, we have Belarus, we have Russia trying to balance all the sides of this very complex. It plays a dual role. It's a mediator, but it also helps fuel the conflict by providing arms to both sides. So it's really been quite of a challenge. In July, we saw an escalation. 17 people were dead on the Armenian-Azerbaijani border. Russia swooped in, brokered a peace deal, but the tension never really subsided. And Turkey, we've seen a growing footprint of Turkey, a growing footprint of Israel, both in arms sales and then also in military drills. The Azerbaijanis and the Turks held one of those drills in late summer. And in July, it was pretty clear that the Azerbaijanis were willing to give, the Turks were willing to give the Azerbaijanis clear diplomatic and military backing. And some of the F-16s that were used in that military drill, those are US produced fighter jets, were left in Azerbaijan, which I think is one reason why the United States needs to be engaged, considering American made weapons were left there, which they shouldn't have been. And Turkey has been playing a very different role today, whereas before it would back Baku, but talk about the need to return to a ceasefire. Now Turkey is talking about Armenia as a regional security threat, which is quite different. And I think I have a few more minutes. So I might just quickly go into sort of what we're seeing right now. First of all, I think the Azerbaijani side is having more success in the fighting than a lot of people anticipated. Its investments using the oil money that it has really been paying off. It's been using drones, Turkish and Israeli, against an Armenian forces that really didn't seem to be all that prepared for a lengthy war. They've been very good at repelling short attacks, but not something that's gone on for weeks. The Azerbaijanis have regained territory, more territory than they have in the past. If you judge by their claims, they've regained some of the occupied territories. I think 3 of them, and they're moving up from the south toward the Lachin corridor, which is a little piece of land that connects Armenia to Nagorno Karabakh itself. And President Aliyev gave an address to the Azerbaijani people where he indicated that Baku is ready to push towards Karabakh itself to retake more land. And he clearly said that Karabakh is ours. And so the public, which was growing a little apprehensive of Aliyev over the summer, has generally been very supportive of the war, and this makes it very difficult for Aliyev to sort of back down at this point, or for the international community to offer him any sort of diplomatic ramp. And then the Armenian side, since then, has taken an equally hard approach. Pashinyan has also claimed just yesterday that without Artsakh, which is the Armenian word for Karabakh, there is no Armenia. The public is backing him for now, although they are kind of shocked by the swift Azerbaijani advances. And we also had 3 former Armenian presidents, all of whom hate each other, met in consultation with Pashinyan, which I think is quite telling considering their mutual animosity. And this has really become an existential fight for Armenia, which I think is very troubling for all diplomatic efforts, because both sides sees this as an all or nothing effort. And then the sort of the negotiating tactics that have been on the framework that the West and Russia has put out there. They've been there for over 12 years now, in which Azerbaijan would get some of the territories back, the first 5 territories and then remaining 2. And Armenia would eventually retain control of that corridor, and Karabakh with an undetermined status. Sort of the solution that has been out there for many years appears to be dead. I don't know what Pompeo has up his sleeve tomorrow, but I sincerely hope they'll be able to sort of broker some sort of at least interim peace agreement. Whether or not it will last, will have any better luck than the French or the Russians have, I think is quite unclear. So with that, I might just end here. Happy to take any questions later on, and I'll turn it over to Bob Cruz.
Bob, please.
Good. Thank you, Paul. Thank you, Amir and Jovana. Thank you for helping us focus our attention on this crucial question of geopolitics. And really, I think as Paul and Amir underscored for us, reminded us, this is a staggering humanitarian catastrophe for all parties that definitely merits our attention. Paul is the wise figure on the panel so far, who has a deep background in all the important diplomatic matters. I propose to complement his important contribution by being a bit more speculative, if I may be permitted that, and focus for a moment with a few slides on what we might think of as the geopolitical considerations that have played some role in shaping where this recent outbreak of conflict has come from, and it might also help us get to an understanding of what lies ahead, of what might be a kind of way out of this. And I'm going to attempt to share my screen here, and for about 15 minutes, talk through a few slides here to try to illustrate just a few, again, somewhat speculative claims about the geopolitical frameworks that we might consider in making sense of this conflict, which again, I think, as Paul noted, is really, I think, most importantly, a humanitarian catastrophe. But let's try to get around the interplay of internal and external factors, which may help us get a better grip on what's going on. Immediately, when one thinks of geopolitics, there are two possibilities here that come to mind. One is very commonly met with in certain diaspora conversations, has to do with what often looks like the timelessness of the conflict, right? It's an ancient conflict, right? Paul noted very cleverly, he slightly moved around the historical question, right? We could spend hours, weeks, months digging into the rich history of this region and parsing out the different kinds of claims about territory, about the relationship between ethnicity and sovereignty. And of course, you have the important role of great power states in the region, most notably, historically, the Russian Empire, and of course, the Ottoman Empire, but also Qadr Iran, at various moments, other actors. So I'm going to try to skirt that question of the timeless inevitability. Yes, this conflict has ancient roots, but I want to make a brief case for why the most recent past has been so formative in shaping the current contours of this conflict. A second thing I'll attempt to dodge is the reflex to reduce this very complex set of issues to a kind of binary proxy war between Russia and Turkey. And to be sure, Russia and Turkey are major players here, and I look forward to discussing this with our participants on this question. I know lots of have ideas about this, so but forgive me, I want to try to avoid that, what I think is kind of a pitfall of reducing this just to a question of what Moscow or what Ankara are thinking. So let me propose a different scenario, again, that I'll try to walk through with just a few points. Under the rubric of thinking of this as a kind of useful conflict, right? Again, it's a kind of cynical view from my perspective, I confess. But thinking about the humanitarian facts that Paul laid out for us, I think it's useful to think about ways to hold the elites of each of these capitals accountable for what has transpired. By no means was this inevitable, but by no means was this unavoidable, is the case I would make. So how do we approach, again, Paul raised a question about whether or not this is a truly frozen conflict, but if you'll permit me, I'll begin with that idea and ask, what caused this, again, imperfectly frozen conflict to become unthawed at this moment in the way that it did? And let me highlight for us, not that this is a return to the past, a kind of rerun of past scenarios. In fact, what strikes me is what is so different in 2020. There are a host of factors that distinguish the political moment from 1994, right? So yes, much looks the same on the ground, of course. I know the many lives of people who inhabit the space. Some things have not changed. But if one looks to the international arena in 2020, I think we see a very strikingly different set of circumstances, and especially recent ones that I'll highlight that are really a kind of interplay of internal and external factors for Armenia, for Nagorno-Karabakh, Artsakh, and Azerbaijan, and indeed for all the regional actors. So there's something special about this moment, something peculiar about this moment that I'd like to highlight for us today. So to begin to turn to that, I'd like to propose a short list of considerations to which we can return in greater depth, I hope, in the discussion. The first is really a host of what we call, historians, social scientists like to call contingencies, that is, contingent factors. And the most important one, Paul has already introduced to us, and that is the role of the pandemic, right? Again, we can't reduce all this, of course, with all this historical richness to the events of the last 8 or 9 months. But the pandemic has clearly had a fundamental effect on all parties involved. And these contingencies, I suggest, are all factors which, again, looking at this from California, from far away, seem to have made elites in Baku and Ankara, but also in Yerevan, a bit more open to undertaking certain risks having to do with the deep tensions that have undergirded the potential for conflict in this space. So in short, the pandemic has played a role in, I think, making the possibility of resorting to violence a more tangible kind of answer in the minds of these key elites. So how can we make this more concrete? To think about the contingent factor of the pandemic. This is about the sovereignty, I'll come back to that. If we can focus on this region for a moment with its attention to the key geopolitical elements of pipelines, gas corridors, the whole hydrocarbon space here that is so important for this geography's geopolitical situation. The most obvious point I think you all already know already is the way in which COVID-19 has driven down demand for oil across the planet, right? This brought about a very dramatic drop in oil prices in March of this year, which of course had ripple effects throughout Eurasia and Middle East. But for Azerbaijan, arguably, it sharpened certain political and social tensions. That is, it added strain to the kind of social contract by which Aliyev rules this space. So as of today, oil prices are in the low 40s, right, per barrel, trading in London. And the IMF projects that they will stay low into 2021, maybe rising to $45 a barrel. Obviously, if one's sitting in Baku or Moscow, as in Riyadh, as in Tehran, these are major calculations which affect all kinds of social questions. So I'm suggesting that this price, the drop in demand for oil, the drop in oil prices, has put the Aliyev government under particular pressures. And again, I'm not a spy, I'm not a diplomat, I don't have access to the internal workings of Aliyev's household, right? But one can presume from certain analyses that the rising tensions around economic questions is, in this scenario, and of course historically in others, perhaps more likely to make leaders like Aliyev engage in certain foreign actions with the aim of shoring up his domestic political support, which in this case, I think to date, I think Paul, has suggested already that in both states, Armenia and Azerbaijan, there's been a degree of kind of popular support for these actions. So again, I'm not reducing this all to oil, but this is clearly a factor in shaping, likely shaping Aliyev's motivations and likely shaping the popular response to it. Now, Turkey has also played a fundamentally crucial role here, as Paul has already noted. And I probably accent Turkey's role more going forward. It's just here too that Erdogan's government faces a kind of crisis as a direct result of the pandemic. As you know, tourism has dropped off quite dramatically, right? This poses a major economic challenge to Turkish society, right? There are other elements that are more complicated happening too. The lira has fallen to record lows and inflation currently runs at over 11%. So again, I'm suggesting a kind of calculation on the part of Ankara that its foreign policy moves at this moment are partly designed to respond to domestic pressures. Again, somewhat speculative, but I think we're on solid ground to suggest that there is an innate connection between external and internal policies. For Armenia, the pandemic has also played a role in that it has reduced remittance, cash, foreign currency remittances that Armenia particularly receives from its 11 million person strong diaspora across the globe. So economists are charting a decline, slowing of growth in Armenia as well. Here too, one might speculate that Stepanyan has been keen to beef up his legitimacy in other ways, given the combined crisis of a public health catastrophe and the new economic challenges of a kind of fiscal crisis brought about by a global economic crisis. So I would second another point that Paul also made about this pandemic moment, in that I think that has allowed leaders to make a kind of abstract calculation that there's something different about this geopolitical moment, right? across capitals across Europe and beyond, in neighboring states, elites are preoccupied with this public health crisis. More broadly, if one looks at other kinds of hotspots, I think one of the frustrations I share with Paul is that, yes, we can't get Washington or Paris or others to think about these issues, but if one looks at the list of current crises that are facing elites concerned with, the creation of peace in various places, it's a staggering list, right? The actors that would play a role here already have Afghanistan, Syria, Libya, Yemen, all on their plate, just to name a few in a few select places. At the same time, alongside COVID-19, across the Mediterranean, both from Greece and across the Mediterranean from North Africa, the continued flow of refugees is another element, which I would argue has contributed to a kind of a moment of fatigue and of distraction with so-called small conflicts, which dot the globe, right? So the major powers who may play a more productive role are preoccupied by domestic and international concerns. And unfortunately for all parties related to our conversation, there are already a number of other peace negotiations, right? One thinks of Doha for the Afghan case. There are already conversations taking place around creating peace where civil war reigns in multiple hotspots across the planet. So there's a sense in which I think this is recognized as a calculation on the part of the actors that we're discussing, but it's also part of the response that we have to acknowledge in thinking about how other actors have responded or not to this crisis. A second point, and this is perhaps another kind of contingency, which I would refer to as we might think of them as technologies of irredentism. And here I mean technology in one narrow sense, right, the literal sense. Paul already noted the important role that aviation is playing in this conflict, right? When you talk about this conflict as a classic kind of trench warfare scenario, and clearly that kind of fighting persists. But what's new and what's different in 2020 is, of course, not just those American F-16s, but more importantly, the Turkish and Israeli drones that the Azeris have been able to use to great effect from Azerbaijan. More broadly, though, this is a pattern that a number of people have pointed to. Both states, both Armenia and Azerbaijan, have acquired new weapons over the last 25 years, 26 years. And in particular, Azerbaijan has used its oil wealth to raise spending from less than $200 million in 2003 to over $3 billion in 2015, right? This includes Turkish training, and again, a kind of close Baku-Ankara nexus in terms of logistics and military technology. More abstractly, and here bear with me as I zoom out again from the region, I think Baku and Ankara in particular have watched global patterns of war. They've looked at the proliferation of these new technologies. They've imagined, as have elites in Washington and elsewhere, that this new kind of technology, particularly the drone, is a kind of game changer, that it will shift the balance, that it will break the impasse, which importantly, Baku has long seen as defeat that it inherited from the early 1990s. So there's a kind of techno optimism. I know we in Silicon Valley live this every day, that these new technologies will somehow shift reality on the ground, and that in the wake of all these precedents, all these, what I would call kind of violations of status quo politics in various places, really go beyond the technology to a more abstract conceptualization of irredentism. And here I would list a long pattern, really going back to the American invasion of Afghanistan in 2001, the American invasion of Iraq in 2003. One can think of interventions in Libya in 2011, led by the United States and some EU partners. One thinks of the Russian annexation of Crimea, Russia's intervention in Syria, Russian and Turkish interventions in Syria, and then later in Libya. All these, I think, are part of the intellectual calculation by which particular elites have thought about the ways in which things can be remade, right? The world can be remade at this moment. And my third point here is that this really, I think, reflects the geopolitical flux of our global order. That is, the global order in flux. Just to illustrate this briefly with a few maps, I think it's really, this is clear that the key actor in this calculation, that is kind of pushing or the two key actors pushing this reevaluation of the global order are, of course, Ankara and Moscow. But a word on Ankara, because I think it's been so pivotal here. Yeah, I've been examining recently, trying to understand, why Erdogan, right, who was not present in 1994, Turkey was not a major actor during the previous major iteration of this conflict. Why is Turkey so invested in this? And here I'll defer to actual experts on Turkish foreign policy, but it strikes me that from the point of view of Ankara, the South Caucasus is one of many theaters which surround Turkey, right? Which surround what some would appeal to as the blue homeland, right? Celebrated here really is as the projection of maritime force, but also obviously this is, if one thinks concentrically about Anatolia, about Turkey, and of course about Armenian Ottoman history, the story of the Armenian genocide, right? One cannot avoid this crucial flank in thinking about Turkey's geography. So to be sure, in recent months, the Turkish Navy and Ankara appears to have been focused on the Eastern Mediterranean, also on a Libyan maritime border, right? Which has led to intense conflicts within NATO, right? Principally with France. Here is not instantly, a backer of Armenian claims often. But with this blue homeland idea, this doctrine, this kind of ideological claim to space, reflects ambitions that are new and reflects Turkey's demands to take a seat at the table as a great power in a fundamentally new way. So I would argue that part of what we see in the last couple of weeks is really another scenario alongside Syria, alongside the Mediterranean, alongside Libya, in which Erdogan is pressing this claim, which is geopolitical, it's ideological, it's about energy, right? Securing corridors to power Turkey's growth and so on. But this, the use of mercenaries from Syria and perhaps from Libya are also part of the story. So this new assertiveness is what's different and what's new. But again, it reflects this multipolar environment in which, yes, the United States is the kind of absent hegemon, but it's not just a vacuum. This is also very much a reflection of the initiative of the Erdogan system. So I'm not saying that Aliyev is a client of Erdogan, that he's a kind of pawn, right? That this is a proxy war. I'm suggesting that there's a confluence of interest between Ankara and Baku, which appear to make this move to revisit the defeat of 1994, to revisit the disposition of territory and so on. At this moment, it made it seem likely. So again, I'm trying to highlight in a somewhat convoluted way a confluence of domestic and external factors. Now, the other major factor here, of course, is Russia. And here to cite an illustration, the nightmare scenario that many raise is the prospect that this conflict will ultimately lead to a Russian-Turkish war. I think Syria is an interesting example in which Turkey and Russia have both made claims, right? They're working out their great power claims on these territories, right? On Syria, on Libya, and now arguably in the South Caucasus. But to add a complicating factor for Russia, and why Russia has been perhaps slower to come to a more resolute position on this issue, is that Russia faces, on the one hand, a very different domestic political scenario, and that it is home to some 3 million Armenians and perhaps 2 million Azeris, right? So one can't think abstractly about the South Caucasus as an external matter, right? From Moscow's point of view, it's an extension of domestic and geopolitics, right? It is nestled in a region where Russian interests are very intense, right? Tied up with energy, but also with stability. So one thinks here of the pivot of Chechnya, also facing a major crisis due to the pandemic. So all these factors come together for Moscow in a way that make its response, I think, to date quite muted, right? Unlike Turkey, it doesn't have to kind of fight its way in to become an arbiter. It is a kind of natural historic arbiter. Armenia looks to it as an arbiter, but Baku historically has also looked to it as an arbiter. Vis-a-vis the EU, Russia, I think, sees this problem as something to highlight its usefulness, right? Especially in the wake of discussions of sanctions, in the wake of the poisoning of Navalny, right? So going back to my theme that this is a set of conflicts, right, to which different parties bring different interests, but in each, arguably each capital can see some usefulness in this crisis, right? I guess is my overarching kind of claim, right? So Moscow doesn't love this conflict, right? But it's going to turn it to what it might imagine to be useful, right? Is one way to imagine this, given all the complicating factors that persist. Looking briefly regionally, I'm exceeding my time, but Iran often, I'm sorry, this is an interesting data point from just this month to complicate our understanding of Russia and South Caucasus. Levada Center does very good public policy polling, and Armenia and Azerbaijan are thought of broadly as friends of Russia, just behind Belarus, China, and Kazakhstan, right? So this is a space where the Russian public feels like Russia should have a place, but isn't terribly one-sided, that it isn't a partisan viewpoint. Zooming out briefly for the region, Iran comes up again and again, right? Azeris are co-ethnics and co-Shi'i populations in some commentators' emphases. And in some towns in Iran, we've seen protests in support of Azerbaijan in the wake of the outbreak of clashes. Khamenei, of course, has voiced support for, that is the supreme leader of Iran, has voiced support for Azerbaijan, but and even though missiles have landed on Iranian territory, Iran has been quite muted. So in our conversation, I'll propose that Iran is, like other states, it's preoccupied. It has a massive public health crisis. It is reeling under American sanctions. There's a very severe insulin shortage. And of course, Tehran's main motivation, I think, today is to not become Trump's October surprise, right? And we'll see how that goes. A final consideration to end on a somewhat lighter note, and thinking about the various international actors which will likely shape the outcome of this conflict, I would highlight the important role of the Armenian Diaspora, which to my mind has no direct equivalent in the case of of Azerbaijan. But here, of course, you have Kim Kardashian meeting with Stepanyan last year in Yerevan, and then Serge Tankanyan, the lead singer of System of a Down, who's a major kind of diaspora nationalist figure, now advocating a kind of humanitarian response to the crisis in Nagorno Karabakh. So these are all, it's a kind of a whirlwind of different actors attempting to shape the outcome here, right? But I think what strikes me more broadly, perhaps my final conclusion, would be to say that this conflict is, unlike 1994, a reflection of the very complicated flux of our global order. It is a representation of kind of multipolar politics, right? It reflects Turkey's newfound ambitions. It reflects the impact of Azerbaijan's oil and gas wealth, all these geopolitical factors coming together. And going forward, I propose that when we are thinking of multilateralism, a multipolar world, obviously that doesn't ring so nicely to some ears in Washington and Moscow, but the flip side of that is the possibility of, especially in such contexts, the South Caucasus, of trying to use this multilateralism to think about sovereignty and citizenship in more elastic ways, right? In ways that aren't so bound to claims based on blood and soil ideologies, and instead maybe more nimble and more reliant upon the positive elements of flux, that is, of citizenship and sovereignty, which don't neatly map onto fixed territory about which these competing parties can fight. So I've taken too much of your time, but thank you for your patience, and I look forward to our discussion.
Thank you, Bob. The Kardashians are always the solution. And we are now to Nona Shahnazarian, who managed to join us. So please, Nona, please take over.
Sure. Hi, can you hear me?
Yeah, with some echo.
Yeah, okay. So thank you for your invitation. And I will start with some stipulation to say that as an Armenian refugee from Azerbaijan, I have to admit that it's difficult for me to maintain some intellectual distance as I'm witnessing how my ancestral houses and cemeteries in Karabakh are being shelled by Azerbaijani forces, just as in early 1990s. But still, I will try to be balanced. On September 27th, 2020, Azerbaijani armed forces, with the support of Turkey and Syrian mercenaries, launched artillery and aerial strikes against Armenian civilian settlements in Karabakh. So under cover of restoring territorial integrity, Azerbaijan is seeking to annihilate the local Armenian population and seize lands that have been under control of Armenian Defense Army since May 1994 ceasefire. The latter was signed by the representatives of Karabakh, Armenia, and Azerbaijan. The sides, however, have been preparing for a renewed war over this territory since the Armenian victory in 1994. But securing de facto control of Karabakh and quote-unquote buffering and quote-unquote occupying a number of neighboring areas previously populated by Azerbaijanis, de facto authorities have managed to form a relatively viable state institutions. This unimaginable smoldering rather than frozen conflict continued throughout the years through sniper war or position warfare, with its peaks in April 2016 in Nagorno-Karabakh and in July 2020 at the Armenian-Azerbaijani transborder. Baku has, for years, spent billions of petrodollars on procuring expensive foreign weapons. The Azerbaijani military has been rearmed by Turkish, Israeli, Russian, and South Korean modern weapons systems, as well as supported politically, diplomatically, and recently militarily by Turkey. This 2020 wholesale destruction is part of violent territorial policy of Turkish President Erdogan to re-establish a version of Ottoman power in the region. Azerbaijan, supported by Turkey, is cleansing Artsakh, which is Nagorno-Karabakh, of its ethnic Armenian population. On September 20, Azerbaijani President Ilham Aliyev publicly accused the Armenian Prime Minister Nikol Pashinyan of provoking a major war. At the same time, he demanded that Armenia, quote-unquote, I'm quoting, unconditionally evacuate Karabakh since Azerbaijan's military has a capability to clear the Armenians out. In Yerevan, Aliyev's war rhetoric was denounced as, I'm again quoting, frustrated rhetoric by a leader disconnected from reality. Again, disconnected from reality is a quotation. Today, Azerbaijan has deployed on its territory hundreds of mercenaries from Syria, mostly from several subdivisions of the Syrian National Army. And Sultan Murad, Firkat Hamza, Faylak Ash-Sham, and Fikret Suleiman Shah, Jaish Ash-Sham. Some of them are located in Baku so that to support Aliyev's regime in case of civil war and any other social unrest. The front line of the soldiers is reportedly composed not only of mercenaries and rebel fighters from Syria and Libya, but also minorities living in Azerbaijan, such as Lezgins, Talish, Avars, Tats, Udis, Sakhurs, Ingilois, Rutuls, and Kurds. And they arrived from the northern, this mercenary actually arrived from the northern part of Syria, controlled by Turkey, namely from Idlib, Afrin, El-Bab, Ras El-Ain, and Tel Abyad. Proofs include numerous photos and videos where those mercenary terrorists wear uniforms of the Azerbaijani border guard troops. I have photo to be screened, but I will show you later. There are also videos filmed by those mercenaries and shared on social media that have been geolocated in parts of Azerbaijan and along the line of contact, Horadiz. Many independent journalists and researchers have provided evidence of their presence. France and Russia's intelligence services have also confirmed it. Although this war can hardly be considered as religious, yet Islam is instrumentalized by the parties so as to make the Christian-Muslim dichotomy salient. In the videos released by independent media, we can hear mercenaries speak in the following terms. Thank Allah, here are their bounty and ammunitions. God will make us triumph over each pig and sinners. And this is by a fighter from Hamza subdivision filmed in Marjan village in the south of Azerbaijan on 3rd October 2020. In another video, a group of Syrian mercenaries is seen riding on pickups under encouraging shouts of the local Azerbaijani population. And the mercenaries shout back in Arabic, "The Prophet Muhammad will always be our guide, which is a characteristic slogan of the Syrian National Army. And this is filmed in Horadiz, again, Azerbaijan, on the border with Karabakh. In a next video, a fighter from Sultan Murad division sent a message to his colleagues in Syria, welcoming them to join him. Let's have fun against Armenia. This religion-oriented rhetoric directly echoes rhetoric adopted by President Ilham Aliyev, who in one of his speeches has promised to wipe out the Christian Armenians like dogs. Against this backdrop, it's important to remember that since 1997, Azerbaijan is party to the United Nations International Convention against the recruitment, use, financing, and training of mercenaries. Here are the provisions of Article 5 of the Convention. State parties shall not recruit, use, finance, or train mercenaries and shall prohibit such activities in accordance with the provision of the present convention. State parties shall not recruit, use, finance, or train mercenaries for the purpose of opposing the legitimate exercise of the inalienable right of people to self-determination as recognized by international law, and shall take in conformity with international law the appropriate measures to prevent the recruitment, use, financing, or training of mercenaries for that purpose. During the 1990s war, Islamic mercenaries were already used by Azerbaijan against Armenians. They were mostly Chechen and Afghan terrorists like Shamil Basayev and Ibn Hattab. Still, at that time, the conflict was defined as local and in the process became regional. With the involvement of new social actors, such as organized ISIS, the conflict has acquired global dimensions. The threat faced by Nagorno-Karabakh and Armenia today can be framed as a struggle against global terrorism. Discussing the origin of origins and implications of recent developments for the region, one can see the changing prospects for diplomacy. The negotiation process was challenged by the essential contradictions both in international law and in the discursive line of diplomatic documents, and let's say Madrid principles. That is to say that we can find dominating point of again, quote unquote, territorial integrity, which helps Azerbaijan to insist on its rights on the territory even after the defeat in deeply asymmetric war of 1992-1994. At the same time, self-determination is part of OSCE Minsk Group founding principles. Due to the lack of trust between Armenians and Azerbaijanis, Armenian side has been insisting on a package solution versus step-by-step solution that would guarantee the security of Karabakh Armenians. We have to recognize now that the fears of the Armenian population have proven grounded since the methods of Azerbaijan to deal with the Armenian issue, quote unquote, haven't changed over the past 30 years. Today, the ongoing process of ethnic cleansing shows that all the discourses on giving Nagorno-Karabakh, again, I'm quoting Ilham Aliyev, cultural autonomy, under the jurisdiction of Azerbaijan are but lip service. The constitution of a de facto state in Nagorno-Karabakh Republic, based on democratic values, represents a strong argument against reintegration into dictatorial regime of Aliyev, Pashayeva clans. It will be a degradation of the achievements in the field of human rights and democracy in line with progressive values, especially after Armenia's 2018 Velvet Revolution. As for the role of international actors, the greatest disappointment is with so-called progressive allies who don't miss opportunity to speak out against injustice elsewhere, but keeps silent when Turkey, as an ally of Azerbaijan and direct party in this war, is pursuing neo-imperialist, neo-Ottomanist expansionism in the South Caucasus. The lack of concern and solidarity demonstrated by international colleagues and partners has led many Armenians to feel isolated in this existential war. The both-sidism of many Western scholars is actually very detrimental to the idea of human rights as such, since it equates a democratically elected progressive regime with a dictatorial regime which ranks 168 out of 180 in the Press Freedom Index, and which imprisons and persecutes its opponents. This makes the Armenians feel that all their efforts in terms of democracy and human rights during all these years have been in vain, since in these difficult times, the Western human rights advocates and scholars prefer ignoring this important political difference between Armenia and Azerbaijan. Azerbaijani caviar diplomacy seems to have deeply blinded even the most outspoken defenders of human rights and universal values. Young American Armenians have taken to blocking freeways in Los Angeles and also protesting in front of the CNN offices to draw media attention and to criticize the false equivalence in the reporting. Some have angrily posted the hashtag Armenian Lives matter, expressing their dismay with the lack of concern, let alone solidarity expressed by international colleagues. Today, the war continues to rage and peace seems very distant. Following almost 11 hours of negotiations in Moscow, Armenia and Azerbaijan agreed to a humanitarian ceasefire on 10th October for the exchange of prisoners of war and bodies of the dead. The failure to implement the ceasefire and the continuation of deadly fighting bring us at the forefront of a humanitarian catastrophe that will have repercussion on a wider scale. Without international efforts to stop Azerbaijani offensives in the middle of COVID-19 pandemic, this war is putting at risk all regional and global stability. Let me stop here. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you to all of our panelists. We will now move to question and answer, and I'd like to invite Paul and Bob to also turn on their cameras so that all of the panelists can be seen by our attendees. Okay, Paul, and just waiting for Bob. Questions have been pouring in throughout your comments. We actually have over 136 questions and they keep coming in. So obviously, you know, we do not have the time to address 137 questions, but I have been noting sort of groups of questions and categories of questions on similar topics, and we'll pose those to our panelists. We will try to use our time hopefully as efficiently as possible so that we can cover as much of what our audience is interested in. And I would say that the greatest number of questions that have come in have been on the topic of international law. And the fact that Nagorno-Karabakh is internationally recognized territory, Azerbaijani territory. And the question has been posed why Armenia has not complied with international law and the numerous UN resolutions calling for the withdrawal of Armenia and seeing this as Armenian forces, I should say, and why Armenia has not been held accountable for not complying with international law by the international community. And a related question to that is, you know, what is the likelihood that the OSCE Minsk group framework will work this time if for so many decades it has not been successful? So with that, let me pass it over to our panelists.
Paul, why don't you?
Sure. So, you know, first of all, I do want to reiterate, as I said at the beginning of my remarks, that, you know, Nagorno-Karabakh and the surrounding regions, they are internationally recognized territories of Azerbaijan. The Armenian Karabakhs that were living there 30 years ago had specific, you know, grievances that were justified, but the people who were driven out of the region during the war in the 1990s also have grievances that are clearly justified. And so this is a very complex issue, and you know, there is international law that you know is dealing with this. There's also, you know, groups have the right to secede. And the right to self-determination. So there's two elements of international law, and the problem that we see very often in this conflict is that each side only wants to look at one element of that law. Why is Armenia still occupying those territories? I mean, I think it is clear, as I said, they still perceive a threat, and there have been ceasefire violations throughout all the years. But as I also started saying at the beginning, the Azerbaijanis also, have their core grievance, which is that the territories outside of around Karabakh, it's about over 13%, somewhere between 13 and 20, are occupied. This is a very complex issue, and I think I saw a lot of the questions coming in. And it's very often people take a one-sided look at that. I'll jump to the Minsk group and the Madrid principles. There's been a deal on the table since 2007, 2008, and neither side wanted to take the deal. And that's because of domestic sentiment, fear that these regimes could come collapsing down. And that I think is tragic. I do feel that it's going to be very difficult to get back to a negotiating stance, to get back even where we were a month ago at this point. It's just sort of the anger you see on social media, the anger you see is just going to make this more difficult.
Bob?
Sure, just very briefly, I think Paul is far better informed about this issue. I think, just skimming some of the comments, I think that I share the concern of many of our attendees who have very appropriately, very correctly, very persuasively highlighted the lingering claims of populations displaced by fighting the 1990s. And I think we would all, wholeheartedly agree that those needs are serious, they need to be addressed. Any lasting peace resolution will have to address those concerns. And so I ended my comments with a kind of utopian academic view that in thinking about citizenship and sovereignty, I think instead of thinking in binaries that, something belongs to this state or the other, the future may allow us to think about ways in which people have more than one citizenship, right? Ways in which questions of territory and compensation are worked out in a more kind of elastic and flexible setting, in a way that is not so rooted in nationalist narratives, which in the end are toxic and are not really going to advance the cause of peace. But as a kind of historical claim, as a legal claim, to be sure, I think we would all wholeheartedly insist upon the recognition and acknowledgement of the rights of those who have suffered in the past.
Another series of questions that have come up have been exactly about the refugees and the internationally displaced persons in the region, Azeri ones from the 1990s, but also some of the violence that transpired in the 1990s. And I'll link that also to violence that is being committed now. The question has come up a number of times about the bombing of cities outside of the conflict zone by Armenians, particularly the city of Ganja. And so I was wondering whether the panelists can comment about this kind of violence that is occurring now and that also occurred in the 90s, and what the legacy of that has been for this conflict.
May I try?
Of course.
Yeah. First of all, I would like to answer the first question as well. And as I said, that in my presentation, that this all conflict is going on in this ambiguous international law context, and we have a number of countries who actually aspired and they actually achieved this self-determination. And one can hope that in the long run, with the participation of all international institutions of justice, that the democratic will of the ethnic Armenians of the Caucasus region can be acknowledged. And in recent years, as many territories' declarations of independence have been justifiably affirmed through international agreements. So the Republic of Artsakh or Nagorno-Karabakh Declaration of Independence from Azerbaijan 3 decades ago is as legitimate as any of those. So, and the refugee crisis and the refugee problem is actually going through this whole conflict since 1988. Let's start with this huge amount of about 400,000 people who left, Armenians who left Azerbaijan, and this was like many refugees again coming from Armenia to Azerbaijan, and right now it looks like Azerbaijani side who actually started the war on 27th of September. They think that they can annihilate all population in Nagorno Karabakh. And but the thing is, first of all, there are many fake news about how many rockets comes from Armenian side to Azerbaijan. And secondly, the problem is that that this Ganja city is 60 kilometers far away from Turkey, and there are military aerodromes where these F-16 истребители, I don't know how to say, jet planes are located so that to target Armenian towns and villages in Nagorno Karabakh. And also Azerbaijani drones actually transgress the border, and they actually 4 of them at least, they were in Armenian sky last 3 weeks. So what I'm going to say that this conflict is extremely asymmetrical, and if you can imagine like Turkey with the best and well-trained army in the world, and Azerbaijan with all this oil money investing last 30 years to buying weapons of 5th generation, and this is kind of a bit ridiculous to complain that one rocket came to Ganja from Armenian side, and even that is not proven. Thank you.
Paul, go ahead.
Go ahead, Paul. I'll go for you.
Yeah, a couple things. First of all, I just want to reiterate, I think the use of cluster bombs against civilian populations is immoral and should be investigated as a war crime. And so no matter where it occurs, and the targeting shelling of civilian populations needs to be investigated as well. And we're seeing this happen on all sides of this. We are seeing displaced people. We are seeing a huge amount of people fleeing Nagorno-Karabakh. We're seeing huge amounts of people fleeing towns and cities, not just Ganja, but Tertar and a whole bunch of others on the Azerbaijani side. These are the sort of the victims of the war. It's very tragic. I think all refugees and displaced people who've been displaced, whether they're displaced in the last 3 weeks on either side or displaced 20 years ago, should have the right to go back where they are from, if they want that right. I think that's something that people have lived and they have children and have resettled. But if they want that right, they need to be given that right, and they need to have that right to go back. I think it's very important not to use these populations as pawns in any sort of diplomatic game, and I think that has been the case in the past. And I think another thing that I think is important is that I think, and we see this today, neither side wants to recognize the victimhood of the other side. And that I think is really tragic. And I think it's getting worse and worse. And that's going to spell trouble for the long-term ability to solve this conflict. Bob.
Yeah, thank you, Paul. I mean, you I think already expressed more eloquently what I wanted to say, and that was that we have to pay attention to all civilian populations. And I think the general tenor of my remarks and trying to understand where this came from and where it's going was really to highlight the way in which I see this as a very much top-down elite project, one that harms the interests of Azerbaijani civilians and Armenian civilians. And I think pragmatically looking forward, in addition to what Paul outlined so succinctly and effectively, is that there have been longstanding calls for people on the ground, international forces as peace monitors, as peacekeepers, or ceasefire monitors. I think it's crucial to protect Ganja, right? I mean, it's a beautiful historic city. What happened there was a crime, and I think that one looks at some of the rhetoric coming out of Yerevan, coming out of the Prime Minister's office, it's quite provocative and explosive. So I understand the ways in which there are asymmetries having to do with geopolitical power, but there's also the rhetorical force of nationalism, which is quite threatening, which causes people to often engage in violence out of imagining a kind of out of self-defense, right? So there are all kinds of things that happen around our speech. So words matter in this context, right? So the nationalist rhetoric that comes out of our mouths does affect how people perceive this conflict. But as a matter of law and of ethics, I think I am completely sympathetic with those who do draw attention to Ganja, right? We've not spoken about that as a major feature of this conversation today, but it's certainly true, and that the civilian losses and suffering must be acknowledged on all sides, and that must be part of, as Paul noted, the orientation that one brings to a lasting search for peace. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Another set of questions that have come in have asked about the responses, particularly of Eurasian states in the region, those of the Turkic republics, as well as China and also Georgia. I was wondering if the panelists could comment on the responses of those states, and also to add on the question of whether the outcome of this conflict in what way might it involve the participation of these states?
I can take a shot at that. We're not seeing a whole lot of involvement of China in this. China has sort of stepped up its involvement in the Caucasus, but on this it's been relatively quiet. China does not look kindly on secessionist movements anywhere, and it is. It has been relatively on the sidelines. Now, the Armenian side is always very skeptical of the Turkic partners. I think the Turkic partners in Eurasia, the Central Asian states, could possibly play a productive role. Several of them are in the Eurasian Union. They are treaty allies of Armenia, but they also have these close ties with Azerbaijan. There is a possibility that they could somehow be involved. A country like Kazakhstan is always looking to be a problem solver, and I would hope that maybe they could step in a little bit more. They're probably the only one that can, and they're probably a little bit less tied than the Russians are to either side. Georgia, I also think we need to talk about Iran here, because for both Georgia and Iran, this is a no-win proposition, this war. You have instability. You have both countries have been hit by stray weapons. Both have ethnic Armenian and Azerbaijani diaspora populations. So there's internal issues that need to be done, and neither side is really viewed by the parties. I mean, I think just looking at the comments I've seen come in, a lot of Azeris sort of see Iran as biased towards the Armenians, and a lot of Armenians see the Georgians as more biased towards the Azerbaijanis, given the close economic ties between the two countries. So I would say, for those two countries, this is really a no-win situation. They only lose out of this.
May I add something, please? I can't see China in this conflict at all. I agree with Paul, but I can see Turkey, and as I think we can see a very interesting trends during this war, not conflict, that somehow democratic forces, they stay aside and they are silent, and ultra-radical, ultra-conservative like forces, they jump in this conflict to figure out what's going on. So let's say one example is when the Bundestag member of parliaments arrived to Nagorno-Karabakh to eyewitness what's going on there, and they actually can testimony that Turkey, as a loyal party in this war for Azerbaijan, so Azerbaijan only gives an opportunity for Turkey to bring their journalists and this detection mechanism to see who is actually abusing the ceasefire or any other treaties. So what they actually, and vice versa, Armenian side are more than willing to establish cameras for observation and so that to stop the conflicts, this wild stage of conflict, and to go back to negotiation table. So this is how Turkey is involved, and I think Erdogan is actually a harsh man, and Turkey's involvement in Minsk Group or OSCE Minsk Group should be renegotiated, and he should be just taken out of this conflict because he is too involved party. Thank you.
Bob, did you want to respond to this question? Okay.
Thanks.
Okay. So in that case, we have time for one final question, and a couple of questions came in that also seem very timely and relevant right now, which is what the US role and position here will be, particularly as we have an election a few weeks away. There was one particular question about whether the administration might try to score some foreign policy points in this crisis, particularly as Pompeo set to meet with the Armenian and Azerbaijani foreign ministers. So perhaps with the last question, we can, in a sense, bring it home and address the U.S. role in this.
I can start off with that. First of all, I think the U.S. role thus far has been quite small, and it's been quite disappointing, particularly compared to previous times when the United States showed a lot of leadership and a lot of leadership at serious levels. The United States has been sort of disengaging from the region for the last several years, and I know both the Azerbaijani government and the Armenian government have been a little bit concerned about that, and a little bit concerned that they don't have good avenues into the Trump administration and to sort of cultivate the Trump administration. And I see that this this violence and this war is really happening at the worst time for U.S. engagement. We have the election going on. We have COVID. We have all the problems of social injustice in the United States. And this really started when President Trump himself was diagnosed with the COVID. So he was kind of sidelined from the start. We are seeing a little bit more engagement. And I do think that might possibly, the Trump administration is desperate to have some sort of foreign policy win. They've seen both the French and the Russians broker a truce that they brokered it. It collapsed, but they brokered it. And I could certainly see the Trump administration wanting to do something again to show that it's able to do that. But whether or not it will last and whether or not they have a long-term solution, I don't have high hopes for tomorrow. I hope I'm wrong, because people are dying. But the United States still has clout, and the United States in the past has been able to provide diplomatic roadmaps. Whether or not this administration is strategic enough to be able to do that is not clear to me.
Okay, with this not so optimistic view, we'll have to conclude. What we hope, and hope that we achieved it today, is just to propel to start a certain discussion here with the help of our three distinguished Stanford affiliated scholars. And let's hope simply for the better on all fronts in this region. Thank you so much.
Thank you.